Dennis. I'm the Campus Historic Preservation Officer. I work in capital programs here at FNS. The Campus Historic Preservation Officer is an architectural planning role in the group. As a state agency, we are required to comply with the Illinois Historic Resources Preservation Act, which came out of the National Historic Preservation Act. That just we have to identify historic resources on campus, as well as then work to maintain them and or mitigate any adverse effects we cause on them. So I've been here at FNS for about 7.5 years. I'm an alum of the university, having received my bachelor's of science and architectural studies degree in 1979 and my master of architecture and MBA in 1982. I worked in private practice for a number of years before coming here in 2015 to work. So a lot of this conversation will revolve around some of my own experiences and things that I learned along the way, and just to talk about the history of accessibility on our campus. We've long heard about the long and storied path of the university being a leader in making buildings accessible to university students. And that's very true. The story begins about 75 years ago at the university, 75 years ago. But before that, in 1944, when Congress passed the GI Bill, providing educational benefits to returning veterans coming back after World War II. In this case, most of these were men who had been drafted or who enlisted right out of high school or in their early college years. So then they got an opportunity to go to college, and this was the way that the government wanted to make sure they had opportunities. The situation was such, though, that the University of Illinois, as I'm sure others were across the country, were overwhelmed by men generally wanting to be enrolled. So the University of Illinois, in those days, we had the University of Illinois, and we had the professional colleges at Chicago, the med school, the dentistry school, and the pharmacy school. And so the Board of Trustees created two undergraduate divisions to have like 2-year programs to get people started before they came to the Urbana campus. And one of these divisions was at Chicago at Navy Pier, which ultimately became UIC. And the second one was in Galesburg, of all places, at an old Mayo General Hospital, which was a military hospital that was vacant, that had space. So it was a place they could start classes. And these are your basic education classes generally that freshmen and sophomore would take. So as part of that program, though, they were interested in dealing with some of the veterans who may have been injured and were wheelchair bound, though it was unclear what that program might be. So the dean of that program hired Tim Nugent, who was at the time 24 years old and was a doctoral candidate at University of Wisconsin-Madison, to head the corrective physical education and therapy program. So here's a picture of the main building in Galesburg, our name above the door, and of course stairs into the building. But there were 115 other buildings on this campus that were single-story buildings, so it kind of worked nicely as a place to start a program like this. But what Tim Nugent found or realized very quickly was the conventional feelings of the day were not favorable to trying to educate people who may be disabled. He found a predominant attitude among administrators and faculty members having demonstrable disabilities being on campus, knowing that they felt the disabled students would, I quote, be an extra cost, an extra liability, distracting, demoralizing, present untold difficulties, and probably not put their college education to good use, i.e. it was a waste of time and money to try to educate disabled students. And in most cases, these original students were disabled because of injuries. As the programs have evolved, of course, many of our disabled students have other causes of disabilities. So we talk about the program that he began having a number of firsts, and just some things that were first that we have at the University of Illinois. The first curb cuts at a post-secondary institution, the first fixed route buses with wheelchair lifts, the first college level adapted sports and recreation program, the first study abroad program for students with disabilities, the first and still the only residential program to serve students with severe disabilities who require assistance in performing daily living tasks, and the first state-of-the-art residence hall integrating students with and without disabilities in a unique living learning community. And that's referring to Nugent Hall, of course, on Gregory Drive. On the one above that is the Beckwith program, which is housed within Nugent. That was a program that started in the early 1980s. So with all this kind of history, clearly the whole idea of the wheelchair basketball program is what we all heard about, but it started right off the bat. Again, it was men, in later in the early 70s, they added a women's team. So things were going along at Galesburg. They had 13 students enrolled full-time in 1948 when this started. 1947-48 was the first school year. And things are going along well until in 1949, the governor announced that that division was going to close, and there were no plans necessarily how to deal with the students who were disabled. So they went to Springfield to protest. They came to this campus to protest. And eventually on May 4th, 1949, the University of Illinois provisionally accepted 14 of them to attend school here in Urbana. But no other students would be allowed to enter, and there was no budget for their program. So it was kind of like, well, we promised you 2 years of education. We're going to hold up our promise, end of our promise, and go from there. At the time, though, they recognized that our buildings here on campus weren't overly accessible. So it was agreed that 6 buildings be made accessible immediately in the short term: Lincoln Hall, Gregory Hall, Noyes Lab, Natural History Building, the library, and the Illini Union. And I should probably phrase that differently: not made accessible, have ramps added to them so that people would get in the door in a wheelchair, up to the door in a wheelchair. If you look at our buildings on campus, most of our older buildings have steps up to them or up raised on platform. That's historic. You look at the Parthenon, public buildings were raised up on steps. They stood above things. And we were no different. Harker Hall, which dates back to the 1890s, the main floor is the second floor here. The ground floor was kind of utilitarian. So we have this big staircase. So that's how buildings work. So we had to get people up to the buildings. And so we end up doing things, and we end up with little signs all over the place suggesting where accessible entrances are. And eventually, though, we got smarter. So I should tell you that after those first 6 buildings had ramps added to them, by 1955, the university architects agreed that all new buildings would be made accessible. Again, made accessible, it probably means get people in the building and have doors of proper width, but maybe not all the things we talk about today. Because as you know, in terms of a person in a wheelchair using a building, it's not only getting in the building, it's how you get in a doorway, how you can turn a maneuver in the building, how you can use the restrooms. All those things play into it. But eventually we got smarter, and we started building buildings that were built at ground level, so that the main entries to the building were always accessible, which is our ultimate goal. This is Biff. And we have, many of our buildings had elevators in those days. The elevator was invented, the safety elevator, the modern version, was invented in 1852 by Elisha Grave Otis. And it had ways to, the safety part of it was it just wouldn't fall if something failed. It had the braking mechanisms in it. But even some of our elevators weren't overly accessible, and we'll see that here in a moment. So we still had, after 6 buildings may have had ramps to them, we still had many buildings that, weren't going to place fast. This is the architecture building, speaking from experience. It has steps leading up to it, and it still does today. And when you go in the front door, more steps. So this is not exactly an inviting building to get into. So the way this building has access is on the back side of the building. There is a area well. Back in the day, when I was a student, access to this building was a ramp built into this area well. And there was a sign on the wall, wheelchair access, and they had a couple light fixtures lighted. And down here, there was a half-height door that a person in a wheelchair could go through. And if you weren't in a wheelchair, you had a duck. And it led you into this cattle chute, like you were in a market, to the basement floor. And you had to go around and eventually got to an elevator like this one, an old style elevator that had a outer door that you had to pull open, an inner gate you had to pull open, and then you could get in. You can imagine that this wasn't exactly inviting to a person in a wheelchair. They would always need help doing it. And the other problem with elevators like this is if that inner gate wasn't shut, the elevator wouldn't move. So if you were on a floor and you needed to use the elevator and the gate, it wouldn't come when you called it, it was because the gate was open on another floor. So somebody would have to go fix it. This elevator is actually in the main library. It's called Old Otis. It's from 1925-26 when that part of the library was built. That's probably the oldest elevator we still have on campus like that. So the program moved to Urbana campus, Champaign-Urbana campus. It was housed on the parade ground unit, which was this area where Igoberry Commons is now, over here on the southwest corner of the campus. Here's Lundgren, Clark, and Barton Halls. It was used for housing folks coming back after World War II. We put all these temporary little units on it. And it was called Stadium Terrace, and they made it sound any better. And they housed both single men as well as families. At the time, the rehabilitation program was housed in these tar paper buildings that weren't insulated, weren't heated necessarily, but they were low to the ground, so they were easy to add ramps to. And this is where the rehabilitation program started on this campus. You know, like this is, it's the main building. And this was in 1952, 53, 54-ish. By 1954, we had over 100 students enrolled in the program, or 90 students enrolled, but 170 more for the next fall. So this is where these programs started. But as part of these programs, you know, they also had some experimental things we'll talk about later. But you can get the relationship of this building. So this is the Gregory Drive dining hall, which has since been torn down, and you can see the fraternity house back across to the north, across Gregory Drive. So that's where they were located initially. So as these students came to campus, we had to get past stairs, like at Lincoln Hall, by adding a ramp. But it got you in the door. You know, maybe got you upstairs if there was an elevator nearby that was operable, but that was about it. Besides the issue of ramps, you see the first temporary ramp at the library. This is long since been replaced with a concrete one on each side of this entryway. The other problem we had were doors. Rule of thumb is you need 32 inches of clear space for a wheelchair to fit through. Many of our doors on this campus were 30 inches or less, or they were pairs of 28-inch doors. So like at the library, you see these are all single doors. You couldn't get a wheelchair through necessarily. So what we at the library we ended up doing, we took two of these doors, reconfigured them to be a pair, but they're still too narrow. So you have to, with an operator, operate them both at once to let a person in. So we started making do with doors and ramps, but we still weren't, making great headway. 55, like I said, the Unit Secretary agreed new buildings would be accessible to whatever that meant. 1950, we made our first curb cuts, green and right outside of Altgeld Hall. Our students knew various ways to use our ramps. When the students were housed, the male students were housed who were disabled, were housed in the parade ground units. After some fighting and pushing and badgering, they were able to house female students in Lincoln Avenue residence with some accommodations. Our first woman graduated in 1956 from the university, was in a wheelchair. Males, of course, graduated sooner. But for the guys that were living at in the playground units, they took their meals at Flag Hall, which served the residence halls that were on that side of campus at the time. So in 1954, we spent $2,950 to build this ramp on the west end of Flag Hall to get them into the building for their meals. This ramp has since been replaced by a ramp at the other end of the building that's much more modern looking. And on this building at the west end, they since have added an elevator tower to all the floors. So over time, we keep making progress in this area, but we had to accommodate, an existing building that was relatively new to provide a place for the students to eat their meals. The other issue, of course, we had on campus was when they lived here on the southwest corner of the campus, getting to class. And initially, they had to either push themselves or catch a ride with somebody. But in 1955, we started our fixed route bus system, buses with hydraulic lifts that would take students to where their classes were. So the idea of the Division of Rehabilitation Educational Services, besides helping students get their education, they did a lot of research. In fact, we are the premier researcher in this field. That the research done here led to the development of the American National Standards Institute A17.1 document that spelled out guidelines for accessible buildings. A lot of the research was co-sponsored by the Easter Seal Society, and the President Eisenhower's Employ the Handicap program. It tried to identify those issues that need to be considered when designing buildings. So one of the things they did was study ramps. So one of the rules we use now during a ramp, you can have a 1-inch rise in a foot, a 1 in 12 ramp. You see the peg holes here on these two posts? They would reconfigure and configure this ramp in various ways, different slopes, different lengths, different landings, and test and measure the participants in the study, how fast it took them, how hard was it to go up the ramp. They measured respiration. This picture shows a student with a device measuring his respiration as he's wheeling on a flat surface. This, we have a student kind of like on a treadmill kind of thing for the wheelchair with all kinds of gadgets attached as they're measuring various body functions to determine, what makes the most sense for a ramp height, for a ramp slope, for how long before you need a resting place for a landing. Other things we studied, dealt with, lateral reach, the fixed wall on the right, a movable wall on the left to see it where you could go. The turning radius by using one fixed wall and 3 movable partitions to see how tight, how much space was needed to turn a wheelchair, and recognizing that persons with different abilities, different motor skills, there might be different answers. So trying to arrive at what the appropriate standard should be. The horizontal reach of a person in a wheelchair. We talk about operable devices being a certain height off the floor. That came out of these studies, kind of thing. So eventually in 1961, the standards were published. And they've been used ever since. They were the basis of other laws along the way. They were the basis, of what we call in Illinois, the Illinois Accessibility Standards. They're the basis of the American with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines. Each group tweaks things a little bit based on things they've learned since, and these have been updated regularly. But all that research happened here at the University of Illinois, from our Division of Rehabilitation Education Services. So if you're like me and you have to look in the code book and you see these wonderful pictures showing when you have a door, what kind of space you need around a door to provide access. These are not just somebody's pretty pictures. These are all based upon the research that was done. So we began design buildings that we understood that. Now, having said that, as we're studying these things, doesn't mean all the buildings we built were necessarily up to snuff in the best ways possible. Early on, accessibility meant, a ramp, and then it got to be a ramp in the doors, and then it got to be the ramp in the doors and one restroom for each gender. Not all the restrooms in the building. So, it was kind of a growing, getting used to it kind of situation. So example, psychology lab was built in the late 60s, early 70s. It's on the pedestal, has that brick patio covered porch, which has a nice ramp up to it on the north side. And a big revolving door for most people to use, but a person in a wheelchair can't use a revolving door. So of course there's a person door right next to it. But there's another door over on the west side that, unless you wheel across the ramp, across the patio, the plaza, you can't get to. The psychology building was originally built, the accessible restrooms were in the lower level, and that's where the classrooms were, yes. But if you were one of the researchers working on the other floors, or a research subject on the floors, and you were in a wheelchair, you had to go all the way down to the basement to use the restroom. Right now, there's a project that's being worked on and being completed that is adding accessible restrooms throughout the building to make it much more compliant with the intentions of what we want to do on campus. So this went on for 12, 14 years, and it wasn't until about 1954 there was actually money put in the university budget for this program. It relied on the donations from groups like the Eastern Steel Society. And then in 1966, the Real Education Center down the street here on Oak Street was built and dedicated. It provided spaces both for administrative work, for research work, therapy for students. There's a large gymnasium kind of space here on the north end of the building, which has served them well over the years. But it did have one drawback. It was on the western edge of the campus, a fairly good distance from where other activities are happening. That's why there's conversation that goes on here nowadays that should be relocated as described in our 2017 campus master plan. So, how we deal with some of these things. This is David Kinley Hall. Again, the problem with steps outside, steps inside. So one entrance to David Kinley Hall, we redid the steps. We leveled the platform up. You see more steps here than there were in the previous picture. And you also will notice that then when we raise the platform, there's a ramp here on the side. The whole door opening got reconfigured so we could have doors of the proper width that were flat inside. I keep hitting the wrong button. Flat on the inside to take you into this building. Problem with David Kinley Hall is that the elevators at the other end of the hallway where this door is. So, but this door was had the best reasons for in terms of where the buses could drop a student off, where you could do the best work to get the ramp built and what have you. And that's the other problem we sometimes occurs is that we have buildings that have only one elevator. And if that goes down, that means a person in a wheelchair is out of luck and moving up and down vertically in the building. So more and more in our facility standards require that we have two elevators in the building so we can provide the backup to that situation. Now, to the west behind David Kinley Hall is Wohlers Hall, or Commerce West as it was originally built. When this was remodeled in the 80s, they added these curved ramps to the front entryway to get up to the level of the doors. But because when you walk in the doors, there are steps. So on the side here, they added a small elevator to bring a person up to the main level. And then there's an elevator each on the hallway. In addition, at Wohlers Hall on the south end of the building, there's a ramp that takes you to the building. Then there's a ramp on the inside to take you up to the main floor here, as well as on the east side alongside the lecture hall, there's a ramp that starts low and follows the rake of the lecture hall up to the main floor. So this building has 3 major entrances that are accessible. There's still some that aren't. 2 of them will come off a stairwell landing, so that's hard to do anything with. But it's a improvement of trying to make more and more entries accessible, so that a person in a wheelchair is not limited to where they go. Throughout this period, then also university housing was beginning to become more accessible. When Allen Hall was built in the 50s, it was touted as having the potential of 100 rooms available to those who are disabled on the lower level that were accessible by a ramp, that had toilet facilities that had more accommodation built into them. Shortly thereafter, in the late 50s, early 60s, when the 6-pack, the Peabody Drive and Gregory Drive halls were built, each of those buildings had a first floor section that had rooms for disabled persons, and again, toilet rooms that were designed differently. And then after that, the newer ones after that, ISR, PAR, and FAR, were just naturally designed to house disabled students by their very initial designs. Fast forward a little bit to the early 1980s, the university received a bequest from Guy Beckwith, who wanted to build a facility to help students learn how to live and their daily living issues within a residence facility. So Beckwith Hall was built over on John Street, housed like 18 students. It had live-in staff that provided assistance and aid. This was kept in place until Nugent Hall was built in the early 2000s, and then that program transferred lock, stock, and barrel, as well as grew as it moved into Nugent Hall, which integrated disabled students with non-disabled students in a state-of-the-art modern day residence hall. As we continue to build on this campus, the idea that we've made it is not true. We always have accessibility issues we're dealing with. We maintain an ADA transition plan that's identified things we need to work on. Any number of projects going on right now are working to improve accessibility in our buildings. There's one project over at Cranach Center for Performing Arts to make a theater accessible from the public lobby for a theater patron, rather than having to go down into the bowels of the building to come in a side door to get a seat in the theater. So as we do things, we keep trying to make things better and better and better. One of the current projects going on is the redevelopment of the undergraduate library. And as you know, again, the entry pavilions are set up on the plaza, which is 6 steps up from the grade. Yes, there are ramps on the south and the north, which don't necessarily meet the requirements of the current codes, but they get people up there. There's an elevator in here, which is iffy at best, if whether it meets the size requirements for an elevator under the current codes. So as this is being redeveloped, we're looking at ways, of course, how to improve those things. One of which will be adding a second elevator on the other side of the building, so that, you know, again, in case an elevator fails, it's not somebody's out of luck. But we've also talked about, as we look at this, the whole idea of universal accessibility. Can we get rid of those stairs altogether? Don't be confused by this new pavilion. It's got design concept, which is probably going to come about. But the idea we could slope from the broad walk here up to those steps in a slope that's less than 5% and make it all natural. So a group of people who may be both disabled and non-disabled could all go together to the entry of this building. The same for every person to get to inside the building. There aren't special, you don't have to go around the corner here and go up the ramp over here or anything like that. So, you know, that's a whole concept called universal design, which has been about for a number of years, which is a design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed understood and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. So the idea that everybody can go in the doors here the same way is a good illustration of universal design. Universal design has 7 basic principles in terms of equitable use, flexibility, simple and intuitive. You don't have to sit there and try, oh, if I do this, I do this, I do this, I can get in. Perceptible information in the simplest form as possible. Allowance, that if something doesn't work quite right, a person can still get in the building, to have it happen with the lowest amount of physical effort, and that there's appropriate size and space, so as the person approaches, they can do what they need to do without, having their physical size impact it negatively. The work over the last 75 years has been quite significant here on this campus, and yet we are not done, and we won't be done until the day that we don't see any more signs like this around. It's when there was a Harvard business professor who used the term BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal. And a big, hairy, audacious goal was one that you would never reach. And it's clearly the case on this campus. I don't think we'll ever reach that point. But each day, each project, each time we think about it, when we move to this point, it's better that we eliminate having to need these signs and make things as accessible always as possible. It's a way to be inclusive of everybody, which is the whole goal of it. One last thing to share is that on our university website, we've had a series of accessibility documents, plans of how a building's accessible, and those have been being upgraded recently by the space group and the facilities information resources group. And this site is out there. It's being finalized at the moment, where you can actually pull up a building. And I'm going to pull up Wohlers. And it gives you information about the building's entries and what have you, restrooms, elevators. And then it shows you in the building by floor where accessible restrooms are, where the elevators are, what have you. And
excuse me, Dennis.
Yeah.
Are you trying to show us the website? Because we're still seeing the presentation.
I'm sorry, Jim.
All right, thank you.
Let me see if I solve that problem here. So why is it not showing that screen?
You might be able to just minimize your presentation and it'll be behind it.
I think you'll have to unshare and share again,
Yeah,
because I think you're
did
just
that.
you just did presentation window to share. Yep.
Did it pop up?
Yes.
We see it now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have a green bar around anything today. So this drawing it's linked to our space databases drawings, shows that there's an accessible entrance and automatic door here. Here's that little elevator we talked about a little bit ago. Shows that there's an entrance here that's accessible, and shows there's an entrance here that's accessible. It shows a path of how you get from the door to the elevators. Shows you where there's ramps. Again, it shows you where there's restrooms. So a person who wants to learn about a building who may have a need can come use this website as a way to do that. It can also, it give you a sense of where you are in relation to other buildings, where classrooms are. If it will tell us if classrooms have listed hearing assistive devices available in them. Just a tool that we have out there to communicate the work we've done. This building's not bad in what it has in it. You'll pull up some that again will have just. Well, if we go to architecture, for example. You're still seeing that?
Yes.
Okay. So nothing on the ground floor is accessible. The accessible entries in the basement coming down this ramp, you see the ramp issue here and into the basement, and then you see the path. And we can turn off layers. If I get rid of. Well, you see the path that gets you to the elevator that takes you up to the other floors. This is the only accessible way into this building down this ramp from the north side, which is not necessarily the most public way, but it's better than what used to be in this area well that came to the same point. At least this is a real ramp kind of thing. So again, we keep working at these things to make ourselves better. Our facility standards help us do that. We work consistently with our PSCs to find these things and talk about the best ways of doing things, and to carry out the heritage and the legacy that we have on this issue that Tim Nugent and others laid the groundwork for. So where are we? My goodness. Are there questions, comments?
Dennis, I just asked, is this, the website that you're showing, is that available as an app, or do you have to go online in order to get it?
I don't know that answer. Jim, do you know? Or Beth or Chad or? It said, I read someplace that talked about being visible on phones though.
It's a responsive design, so you should be able to view it on your phone, but you have to go to a web link. There's not a separate app for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you got to use Chrome on your phone to go to the site.
I just didn't know if it was part of the Illinois app that we have on our phones. Some of us have on our phones.
Dennis, there was a couple of questions in chat. I don't know if you can see them or not.
Okay, hang on. I just closed it down so I could see.
By the way, Cheryl, like the exterior doors project that I'm collecting data for, will probably try to link the ADA doors and ramps into the Illinois app.
Very nice.
Yep.
Thanks, Sartak.
So yeah, the,
Yep.
the comments about the doors and operators, those door operators we see that are, the Florida 3 foot above the floor ones are one of the things we use on campus a lot. They're not necessarily required by the code because as long as the door does not require more than a certain amount of force to open it, it complies. But what's nice about it is because of varying degrees of ability, it lets people, of all kinds use their foot or use the foot pad of the wheelchair to open a door, kind of thing. The non-touch, now I'm not sure we've seen a lot of those. But the button doesn't put on undue wear on the door because it's just opening the door probably in a more controlled manner than some people would open the door. You don't get the hard forces or pulls that sometimes you get by some people who are in a hurry to get through the doors. So Arlene, it's okay. Good luck.
Dennis, are you involved in any of the plans, the future plans for any of the accommodations? I know we
Not-
have the Office of Access and Equity that's got, a place where you can put in if you need a reasonable accommodations. Are you involved in that at all?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, this is Jim Sims. Our office led with the code compliance and fire safety group are working together with Office of Access and Equity. I think at least 1 or 2 people from that office here on this talk, and but it's led by Allison Kushner, and we work with them on a regular basis, whether it's a whether it's, something that's a specific programmatic need for an individual or thinking long-term strategically. So, we're working with them on a regular basis.
So I know FNS in the past has done an accommodation on elevators. I think, didn't we do that a few years ago with making it so that could be a call badge worn rather than having to push anything for the elevators?
Again, I don't know anything, but I know housing has some of those situations with some of the entrances to their buildings also, that proximity sensors are sometimes used versus physical touch.
Yeah, there's a few different, I forget the name of them, but there's a few different options that are being implemented across campus that increase the accessibility for people with different types of disabilities. There's different like touch pads that are more accessible, for instance, that are being used and implemented across campus.
Some of you may have seen the new elevator over at there's one at MEB in the City Lou MEB that has the touch pads below around the elevator for various floors. And what they started using that when they had blankets over the elevator that protected that. If you start pushing many of those together, it confused the elevator. So we have to have some learning about when those exist in construction situations. An example of something I am going to work on later today is we're looking at the Music and Performing Arts Library over in the Music Building, which is a two-story library. It has a connecting staircase within the library. But to get there, if you're in a wheelchair, you have to go out in the hallway, go upstairs, and have somebody open the door for you on the second floor. It's not accessible within the space itself. And at times that doesn't, make any difference. Other times it does make a difference when the library's hours and the music building hours don't line up with them. So it's been on our list for a number of years to look at how we can get an elevator into that space so the music library can exist as a accessible space on its own.
Dennis, I can also just add, as a university, we're required to have what they call an ADA transition plan. Ours was developed in 1994, back when some of the first legislation, ADA legislation passed, and but we've continued to update that. We're required to keep that updated and continue to make progress. And over the last 5 years, we've done an accessible survey in conjunction with the Champaign Regional Planning Committee. They looked at all of our sidewalks at the university, as well as we looked at many of our main buildings on campus, the access from the right of way from those sidewalks to the entrances, and those are identified, any sort of accessible barriers. And I believe, Sarthik, you're working together with Stacy DiLorenzo and with our construction services group to address, we're taking, addressing those barriers one at a time across campus in different areas of campus. And then we've also recently had a couple surveys that have accessibility surveys in, I think, about 60 of our major buildings on campus to see if there are any identified accessible barriers. And we have now a list of accessible barriers that we're also working towards, developing plans to address those. Not only it helps that they're identified, let's say when we have a capital project, we address them then, but at the same time, we're also looking and working again with the Office of Accessibility and Equity to, get the funding that we need, to address those barriers across campus. So those are some of the other current initiatives regarding addressing accessibility across campus.
It's an ongoing process. As we learn more and as we identify things, we need to deal with them to always keep our best foot forward.
Dennis, this is Rebecca. Hey, you spoke about the Beckwith learning living area where, it accommodates people who need regular help as being the only one still at a university. I just was wondering, we're part of the, Big Ten, like, are there any like peer institute groupings where we're like learning from each other, or people are coming here to learn about the Beckwith thing, or is there any collaboration with other universities where we're like a leader or getting information from other people that's helping us here?
I'm not familiar enough with that to answer that question, Rebecca.
Okay.
You would hope that would be occurring. Because certainly the idea of collaboration makes sense. But I don't know.
Yeah, thanks.
How many available handicap accessible rooms are there on campus? Is there a count for how many? I know we started off small, but now we've got whole floors dedicated.
In many cases, part of that question revolves around whether they have the proper window hardware for emergency exiting. The project that's been done to replace the windows at Oglesby and for Elise, the second one of those is finishing up this summer. There are accessible rooms on different floors, but it's the ones that on the first floor that are specifically that way have special hardware. So I don't know if housing has a count. I don't know. And whether it would be considered like, could any of the first floor rooms in a building on grade be considered plus some above them based upon the exiting requirements? Because as we build buildings of floors above the first floor, newer buildings in the stairwells, as well as a lot of our other buildings have been reconfigured, have what's called areas of rescue assistance in the stairwell. They have an emergency phone and what have you. So a person who cannot get down the stairs can have a place to stop and wait until a first responder can get to them to get them out of the building.
Is every building on campus now considered at least marginally ADA compliant then?
I'm not sure I could say yes or no to that question. Our hope is yes, but I suspect, that we still have some buildings that would be marginal, that might not even get to the point of saying it is.
Okay, fair.
And that's, that's part of the reason behind the transition plan is to, keep track of those things and not but ignore them. There was a period of time in the 70s, particularly after the Education Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 came out, that there was a concept that floated around for a while of program accessibility, that if something wasn't accessible, if you could relocate the program someplace else and still provide the service, it would work. It kind of like not a whole lot different necessarily than the separate but equal kind of things that went on with segregation in the prior to the Brown decision, and that had the same kind of problems. The course I want the professor slab on the second floor, and it does this is can he teach on the first floor? She teach on the first floor this semester, and it doesn't always work well in that regard. So the more we could make it buildings fully accessible, all spaces fully accessible, the better off we'll be.
And I see if everyone can look in the chat, there's a report barriers to access link in there for anyone who wants to report something to Office of access and equity or accommodations and accessibility. Get people where they need to be, because we can't fix it if we don't know about it, right?
Yeah. And that's another thing I say about DRES, and I dealt with the movement, the physical movement part. There, and we had a person talk about hearing and other kinds of disabilities, and they deal with the whole gamut of them. You know, their original name was Division of Rehabilitation and Educational Services. They, in 2005, their name was changed to Disability Resources and Educational Services, to imply a kind of a different approach to what they were doing, and a more modern approach to what they've been doing as they've evolved also. Is they've been in existence for going on close to 75 years now.
And of course, they cover things, not just physical handicaps now, they also cover people who have ADHD or autism, and people who are hard of hearing, blind. It's not just wheelchair accessible anymore. Now we're dealing with all sorts of people who at one time might not have been coming to the university.
And you know, like the whole ADHD thing, Asperger's syndrome, which may or not being used as a diagnosis anymore, which is on the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum. You know, Temple Grandin is one of our famous graduates who has been diagnosed with that, and she regularly talks about those kinds of things in her interviews, in her what she did here.
Are there any more questions for Dennis? If not, I'd like to thank him again for speaking with us. This was wonderful to listen to, and makes me proud to be a part of this university, knowing that we're such a trailblazer for so many of these things. It's nice to have your historical background on this, Dennis, just to get the whole full picture. I knew, the little part that I knew, but to get to see the whole thing from beginning to now is amazing. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.